it's Karen with the Rutgers Edge. I'm so excited to join you this evening to do a very special presentation about college standardized tests. If you have been, dealing with this with your student, or if you're a student yourself, I'm sure you've been hearing it from your friends and teachers and things. It is just so much information, and none of it is very clear. And I am not a test prep expert. It's certainly something that I cover with families, but I was like, let's just go to someone who deals with this on a daily basis. So I reached out to my friend Erica, who is on with us. She is the director of tutoring with ArborBridge, which is the premier test prep company in the world. I recommend ArborBridge to all of my clients, both domestically and internationally, and they are amazing. And I'm sure Erica will go into a little bit more about how you can work with ArborBridge as well. But with that in mind, we are going to jump right in. And Erica, take it away.
All right, excellent. So I'm going to do this fancy thing where I share my screen. So hi everyone, my name is Erica. Just a little bit of background information on me. So Karen and I actually know each other because we played for the same rugby club eons ago. So we do have that connection, but I've been working, I calculated this the other night, and frighteningly, I've been working in the standardized test industry for over 15 years now, and almost a decade specifically on the high school level with SAT, ACT, and 10 million other 10 million other tests that are out there. So, my role in all of this is to advise students and families on what tests make sense for them, and if it makes sense for students to take the exams, about the exams themselves, and just all the different nuances. Obviously, a little thing called COVID happened. So there are more considerations than normal about things to think about when laying out your schedule and timeline and everything. So we'll go over all that information in this presentation, and Karen will kind of chime in with some things that are probably more relevant to sort of the counseling aspect of it. But as far as the test goes, that is what we specialize in. Our company does one-on-one online tutoring. Like Karen said, we specialize in one-on-one work because we're all about making sure you get the most bang for your buck when it comes to the amount of time you're putting into your prep. And that's really what we emphasize. So just like you need planning for that, you need planning to figure out whether or not you should take these tests. So without further ado, so here's an overview of what we'll be talking about. So first thing we'll talk about is the SAT versus the ACT, which I think most people have an idea about, but I'll talk about sort of the differences between the exams and which tests might be better for each student. And then Testing 101 basically covers some of the more basic questions about testing in general. And then we'll also talk about testing timelines in terms of what makes sense, when you should take it, when you should start prepping, is there such a thing as too early, that sort of thing. Okay, so just to start off, this is an overview of the SAT and the ACT and their sections. So just from a bird's eye perspective, in case you don't know what these tests are at all, essentially they are standardized tests that some, not all, but most will look at, most universities will look at in consideration of your entire application. They're both multiple choice for the most part. They're now both about 3 to 4 hours long, depending on whether or not you do the essay. And there's no preference as to which exam colleges will prefer. So maybe 10 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, there was a strong preference for the SAT over the ACT at certain universities or vice versa. That's no longer the case. So it's really about finding out which test is best for you as an individual. So just to give you kind of an idea of what goes on within the sections of the test. So you'll see the SAT has 3 main sections: the reading, which is reading comprehension, writing and language, which is more grammar related, the math, which is math, surprisingly, and then there was an essay as well. The ACT, there's a reading, English, math, science, which we'll get into a little bit later, and also an essay. So I'm going to go a little bit more into detail about these. So the SAT reading section versus the ACT reading section. So a couple things to keep in mind. The SAT, first of all, the reading section here generally requires a deeper analysis than the ACT. The section itself is about twice as long as the ACT section, mostly because the ACT has 4 sections. So more of that is covered on the SAT. So you'll get more questions that require a little bit more deductive reasoning, reading into all of that, rather than the ACT, which tests a lot of recall and speed. So the ACT reading section will ask you questions about, refer to line 10, or, if you look at paragraph 3. So it's about being able to find answers quickly back in the passage. So depending on how your brain kind of processes information, especially with longer passages, that can make a big difference as far as which test might be better for you. So we've skipped over the writing and language versus the English. That's because those sections are grammar. They're just straight grammar, how to use a comma, how to use a semicolon, which I think as adults, we probably don't remember all too well all the time, but it's definitely something that's tested on here, but it's a much more straightforward section on both tests, so there's not too much variance. The math section on the SAT, there are fewer topics, and there is a no calculator portion. There's also a grid in section, meaning that it's not multiple choice. There are some questions where you have to actually write in the answers. And I would say the SAT math section does tend to be more advanced algebra heavy. Versus the ACT, you'll see that there are more topics and it's generally to a higher level. So pre-calculus is usually kind of the most difficult subject that's covered on the ACT. And there's a broader spectrum of topics that are covered. In general, it tends to be a little bit more geometry heavy than the SAT. But again, similar to the reading section, it's much more straightforward than the SAT, which will have a lot more word problems and things like that. So again, depending on your math skill level and where your strengths lie, that'll also impact your overall choice. And the essay, like I said, so great news. If you do have to take the SAT, there is no longer going to be an essay after the June test. So that means that for most students here, you do not need to worry about it. We were just waiting for the shoe to drop basically on this because these essays have become less and less relevant over the years. And most schools had already gone optional, or almost all schools, I think, went optional for the essay. And the ACT still has it. But we do anticipate that sometime soon they will be dropping that as well, but we'll see. They like to move at their own pace, so we'll see about that. Okay, now the stuff that everyone really cares about, which are the scores. So you'll see here that the scoring scales of the 2 tests are quite different. So the SAT is out of a total of 1,600 possible points, with 800 from the math section and then 800 from the verbal, which is a combination of the reading and the writing and language section, or the grammar. The ACT, on the other hand, it's an average of your 4 scored sections. So the English, math, reading, and science, those are all out of a possible 36. And your composite score, which is kind of the overall score that they will look at, is just an average of those 4 numbers. Now, as far as your decision as to which test to take, there are a few different ways to do it. Some students, their school will administer a PSAT or a pre-ACT. Obviously with COVID, a lot of those did not happen, or they were delayed, or whatever it might be. But if you do have those scores, it is definitely possible to make a decision based on those. Or what we recommend are doing full-length diagnostic exams. Our company actually offers them complimentary to all students, and we work with Karen as well to offer those. But basically, it gives us the best assessment of what your baseline scores are, and really helps us make an informed decision as to which test is best for you. And kind of going down into the next bullet, talking about comparing scores. So, those scales are quite different, but really what we're looking at are percentiles. So The 99th percentile, for example, means you're in the top 1% of students taking that test because you've scored better than 99% of the students taking it. And that percentile is what we use to measure the tests against each other and figure out which test is better for you overall. And if we have a full-length diagnostic, let's say you score similarly overall between the two tests, we can take an even deeper dive into the individual section scores and be able to make a recommendation as to which sections might be easier to see improvement on based on your diagnostic test. And then of course, comparing your experiences. So if one test just felt better to you than the other, then that might very well be the best test for you. Some students really like the straightforward nature of the ACT and they love that test. Some students hate the time pressure because there's much more time pressure on the ACT. So then the SAT might be a better test for you, but it's really about taking a look at how you do on those baseline tests.
Erica, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
And I don't know if you, this might be a completely other topic. How accurate do you think those PSAT, pre-ACT scores are? Are they pretty predictive, like a full-length diagnostic, or not really?
So I would say PSAT is much more accurate in our experience than the pre-ACT. So we've definitely used some students will come to us having a PSAT score, and we just have them do an ACT diagnostic, and we're able to compare those two, and they're roughly similar. The PSAT tends to vary a little bit more, that we've seen when we've had students take a diagnostic test, a full diagnostic versus that score. But it is an investment in time to take those tests, because each test, even without the essay, is 3 hours long. So it is a little bit of legwork you have to do up front. So if you're really opposed to doing that, then we can use those scores just as a starting benchmark. But we'll really still want a diagnostic test to get a full view of how best to approach your preparation.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. All right, so testing 101. So this is the part where we talk about the actual logistics of the test. So we've looked at kind of the nuts and bolts of the exam, but now we want to talk about the things you actually care about, which is really what do those scores mean in the context of everything else. So what is a good score? And this is a question we get a lot from families. And there's unfortunately no simple answer. It really depends on your target college. And especially now with COVID and a lot of the test optional policies that have come into play, and even test blind, which we'll talk a little bit about later. A good score is what puts you in a competitive range for the kinds of universities that you're targeting. So if you're working with someone like Karen, who's helping you with those applications and understands sort of the benchmark scores that you need to hit, then we can keep that in mind as a goal score for you. If you're targeting obviously elite universities and looking at sort of those Ivy Leagues, then that's going to require scores that are much more competitive and probably pushing into those top 1 percentile of students taking the test. But it really varies from student to student, and that's a discussion that we like to have with each family to figure out what makes the most sense for you. All right, what is super scoring? So this is always a fun one. So in general for these tests, if you are going to take standardized exams, what we usually do is recommend that students take the test at least twice officially, or at least plan on that. The reason for that being kind of twofold. Number one, almost every student improves the second time they take the test because you have the experience of sitting through the exam. I mean, think of it like when you played your first rugby game. I'm sure nothing quite prepared you for that experience, like getting tackled for the first time. This is very much the same thing. Until you go through that actual experience, you're not really going to understand what that feeling is like. And so going into the second time you take your test, I think we ran the numbers on our students. About 85% of students improve the second time they take the test. So that is something, to keep in mind. The other thing is that with super scoring, it means that colleges will take your best section score across different sittings. So for this student, for example, they scored higher in the math in June, but higher on the verbal in October. Obviously, those are their total scores there. But with super scoring, they will take your top scores across those multiple sittings, giving them a total score of 1210, which is obviously higher than either of their individual sittings. So depending on the university and what their policy is, that can obviously be a huge significant factor in your overall score that you're submitting. I mean, again, I'm ancient now, but back when I took it, I think my super score gave me a score that was about almost 100 points higher than one of my individual sittings. So it really does make a difference overall in terms of the score that you can submit. Now, the other aspect too is score choice, which is when you can control which score a college sees. So Karen, I think you would know better than I do. I think most universities allow for this now, right?
Yeah, I mean, the only one, it's kind of a moot point now, but the only one that didn't allow it was like Harvard and Georgetown, Stanford. I think they wanted all your scores. And then obviously the UCs had we want the highest in one sitting. They didn't really super score, but again, they're test blind now, so it doesn't really apply. So yeah, I think COVID changed a lot of these things, but at the same time, a lot of the colleges that have made these changes, some of them these are temporary. They may stick and they might not. So I think for the families that are maybe younger, a lot of what we're saying, we could probably do this session again, in the fall, and some things might be different. So yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So score choice is basically you can select a full date or select not to send a score because it's lower overall. And so this student, for example, might omit their August test date just because it was lower than either of their June or October scores. And so the schools would only see that June and October one. So, I will say the caveat to this is that this does not mean that you should take the test 5 times. That would be a terrible undertaking just because these tests are very exhausting to prepare for, especially if you want to continually score at a high level. So you really want to make sure that you're measuring out, what makes the most sense in terms of when to take the test and when you can actually prepare for them. Okay. And now, what is an SAT subject test? Well, forget about it. You don't have to worry about it at all. So,
yay!
Hooray! So the College Board recently announced that the SAT subject tests are no longer going to be offered, which is great. They were sort of a dying breed anyway, and there are very few schools or programs that really needed them. And that's not something that we need to worry about anymore. So don't worry about it, is the easy answer. Okay, and then we sort of talked about this a little earlier, the PSAT and the pre-ACT. So they're basically kind of mini shortened versions of the actual exams. The scores are not reported to colleges, so you don't have to worry about that. The PSAT 10, which is the one you take in 10th grade, and the pre-ACT were given in the spring, and the PSAT usually for juniors is given in October. So those are usually the timelines that you're looking at. Again, with COVID, some of that might have changed, but unfortunately, we don't have a blanket answer to some of the dates that are distributed because College Board and ACT are not always the most consistent with what they announce. Okay. Now, extra credit. So what is test optional? We've been talking a lot about this, especially because of COVID and all the restrictions. We had a lot of, cancellations last year that students had to think about and consider overall. So the big difference between there are two kind of policies that most universities have adopted, especially during this time. So there's test blind, which the UCs are, a handful of other universities are as well. This is where test scores are not required and they're not even going to be looked at. They're not even considered. So even if you send them in, they're just kind of floating off in the ether and make no difference one way or another. Test optional, on the other hand, means that they are not required, but if you do send them in, then they will look at them. which does not mean, of course, that it is a guarantee by any means that you will get into a school, but they can still help you. And that's, of course, if you have a score that's competitive with what their typical range has been. Again, a lot of that has, it varies now a lot because of current conditions. Again, I would recommend working with someone like Karen, just because she has a better idea of what these schools are considering, what's important, what's not to them. But in general, a lot of the families that we're working with now, if they are able to get a score that's within consideration for that school and they want to sort of bolster their overall application, then they are taking the test and submitting it. But I think it's much less of a deal breaker than it used to be in the past, which I think is great news for most students. Karen, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I think the only thing I was going to mention is that I think this is a little bit of a moving target. I think a lot of other colleges are waiting to see how this year pans out with so many test optional. I think they want to see what those incoming classes look like. If it didn't seem like it affected the quality of the students, I think many of them will continue, to say test optional. I mean, there's definitely a movement among colleges to say, look, the tests haven't really done much for us. Do we really need them? However, on the flip side, for many of the webinars I've joined with college admissions folks, it does sound like without that extra data point, their job is tougher, which is why, I mean, Erica and I were talking about it beforehand, but there are a lot more wait lists. There's going to be a lot more, decisions that used to be more clear. And now without that extra data point, it's just going to be a little bit tougher. So I would probably say, if you are a current junior, these things, I would kind of make sure you're keeping track of what your colleges are doing. And then the others, if you're younger than that, we'll just definitely have to kind of stay on top of it and find out if colleges are keeping their current policy, are they changing it, and those sorts of things.
Yeah, and I would say a lot of the families we work with now are, especially the ones that started a little bit earlier prepping for this, not knowing kind of what the year would hold and where things would fall. Most of them were still preparing for it, mostly because they said, well, we might as well prep as if it were required. And if it, we get the score, that's great. One of the things that we do emphasize and advise on in the beginning of the process is saying, okay, realistically, how much work is it going to take for you to hit these scores? And I think if you have a very concrete list of schools that you're looking towards and are gung-ho about certain schools and know that you need it, then you should likely prepare for it, especially if you're within shooting range of where their typical scores are.
Yeah, and Eric, I've got two questions here. I'm just going to address them really quick. So one question that came in is just to verify, even with test blind, like the UCs, SAT scores or ACT scores are used to allocate admitted students to courses. So far, if you look on the UC website, it says they're not going to look at them for admission purposes or for scholarships. And this is, again, it's case by case. It depends on the system you're talking about. And this is the tough part, I know, for families, is trying to decipher, like, I wish I could say broadly, this is what it is, but it is going to be on a case by case basis. The UCs have basically said they can use test scores for things like qualifying for certain classes and things like that. And again, UCs can also be broad, right? Like what applies at UCLA may not apply at Davis, may not apply at San Diego. So again, I would probably, if I was in your shoes and you're looking at those UCs, if you still have that question, I would go to each school's individual website, or you can even reach out to their admissions department and ask that question specifically and get it straight from them. The second question is, are test scores still expected for scholarships? And I'm guessing you're talking about merit scholarships offered by the university. And I hate to say this, it depends. So again, it does depend on the school and their system. This year, this cycle, the class of 21, it was unfortunate. There were colleges that said test optional for admissions, but we're still going to look at them for scholarships. So that did put a lot of students in a bind. of, okay, I can get in, but do I maybe need test scores to help me with scholarship? So again, for that parent that asked that question, I would go case by case, and I would, hopefully if you have your target list of colleges, I would look into those specific colleges and see what their policy is for merit scholarships for your cycle. So hopefully that answers your question, and I'll give it back to you, Erica.
I know it's hard because there's never a concrete answer for anything, especially now.
I know.
It's fun times.
I know. We do our best. We do our best.
Yeah. Okay. So the next question, are tests still happening? So like we mentioned before, last year, there were obviously a ton of cancellations. We were sort of in the belly of the pandemic, as it were. Obviously, things are kind of opening up now. I'm actually getting my vaccine tomorrow, which I'm very excited about. So hopefully, as things sort of open back up, we are expecting that tests will continue to be administered. Again, it's difficult because the College Board and the ACT really put it in the hands of the individual locations and cities because the policies varied so much as far as social distancing and all of that. So, I think for the most part moving forward, especially after the summer, I anticipate that the test will be moving forward without any issue. But, that is to say, what it means for you is that you still need to plan for some flexibility. Planning ahead really does make a difference because it gives you those ample opportunities. So you're not sort of scrambling for a testing center. And, thankfully, I think this class is a little bit better than the previous year that we're trying to get all their tests in right before the cycle. But yeah, so, you just need to plan ahead basically to make sure that you have all your ducks in a row for that. So another thing that had been thrown around a lot last year, particularly before the pandemic, was that there would be computer versions of the SAT and ACT. So right now, the College Board said that they will be making an announcement in April about whether or not they'll be doing an online version, a home version. That was something when they didn't really know what was happening with the pandemic, that might be a possibility. The ACT had originally planned for a release of a computer version in the States, or at least individual section ones in fall of 2020. That didn't happen for a myriad of reasons. But we do anticipate at some point, if these tests do continue to live on, which it looks like they will at this point, that they will move to an online format just because it makes the most sense logistically. And yeah, that also means that there are, for us, for example, because we work a lot with international students, and international ACT has been computer-based for the last, I want to say 2 or 3 years now. And so there's a curriculum that's actually developed for that understanding. It sounds very odd, but knowing how to scroll back and forth effectively in your reading passages, you get a little whiteboard for your math problems, which is different than doing it on paper. So, things like that, techniques that will affect you overall. Those are all things that you would need to work on if and when it switches to that point. And also, if you have paper available, then do that. That would be the other thing. All right. So I just wanted to throw this in really quickly about AP exams, because there was a lot of hullabaloo about this last year. You might remember that last year, again, because it was sort of in the middle of everything happening, there were 45-minute versions of the exam versus the 3 hours that students were taking at home and online and proctored. But that, I think, gave them a lot of information about what worked and what didn't. But for right now, what is happening with the AP exams? So they are going back to the full-length format. And it's a mix of paper and digital tests. The paper exams are going to be administered in person in schools. And those will be kind of the standard paper exam that has always been given. And then they will also have digital versions of certain exams the weeks after that point, either in school or at home. And this is going to vary from school to school. So you'll want to check in with your administrators about those dates, what format, all of that. and again, there's no blanket answer for this because it's done from school to school, but this is essentially what's happening. If you'd like, we do have a whole blog post written on kind of all the policies, what you need for, the APs and all of that on our site, and I can send that to you if you do want more information on that. Okay. Now this is say, don't panic. What do you do now? So just trying to figure out what you're going to do at this point. All right. So what do you do in terms of testing timelines? So as you know, junior year is typically the time that students take these exams. And so our big thing that we emphasize, and I think everyone wants to feel confident going into the test. It's hard to prepare for really a long exam that isn't the most pleasant to prepare for without knowing kind of what the end goal is. So we offer complementary diagnostics for both the SAT and ACT to help figure out which test is best for you, like I mentioned in the beginning. So I would say by early fall, we usually recommend that you take a diagnostic test, and that way we can set up a prep plan. And typically students will prepare for about 2 to 3 months before they take their first test. So if you start in the fall, then you can see your different testing date options there. The ACT has a couple in the spring, and then you have the March and May dates as well for juniors. And then, you can continue your prep, take your test a second time, which is what I mentioned before as well. And then if you do need to continue and take it one more time, then you have that summer between junior and senior year to prep and take the test once more. This is kind of the standard junior, standard student timeline. Obviously, there are a ton of different factors that come into play, particularly Karen can speak more to this about being recruited and, what the timeline looks for that, which again, COVID has, I think, shuffled around a lot, but.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I was going to mention is the thing that I tend to remind students all the time when it comes to testing timelines is that the best timeline is also, especially talking about an athlete, is when is the best time for you to really concentrate on prep. So, for example, if you're somewhere where your season tends to be in the spring, say now, like March through June, maybe you don't want to take your first test in June. This does require planning, right? And thinking ahead and saying, okay, well, the best time for me when I'm going to have downtime, when if I do have prep and I have to have meetings and kind of do homework on, preparing for this really big test. Maybe I want to take it in August because I know I'll be out of school, rugby will be done, I'm going to have some downtime at home. So really thinking through when is the optimal time, right? Where you're also not bogged down by AP tests and finals and whatever the case may be. So kind of thinking through what does your year look like and when is the best time for you to study for these things, because they're definitely not something, if you're going to use them, if it's going to help you in your process, it's not like, hey, let's just show up and see what happens. It really does require some planning and some prep.
Yeah, and I second all of that. It's really about optimizing when you have that amount of time. If you're super heavy in season, then that's a time that we want to avoid. And that's also something that we help you figure out. But really, it starts from that diagnostic test, because that's going to give us the most information about where you are and then what makes the most sense in terms of your timeline. So, this is a standard student, but if you're looking at, and then there's your PSAT and pre-ACT if you're going to take that. So that's your standard student. But if you get started a little bit earlier, so right now I'm actually talking to a lot of sophomores who are taking their diagnostic tests now, or in the beginning of summer. So between summer of sophomore and junior year, a lot of students utilize that time frame to do the heavy lifting of their prep, just because they know that junior year is going to be particularly heavy for them. So it just pushes that timeline, a couple months earlier. And, depending, like Karen said, depending on when your season is, we can help work around what makes sense for you. Not to move too quickly through this, but if you're an AP student, for example, and you have your AP exams, you don't necessarily want to be preparing for this as you're preparing for your AP test. So we can help you plan out, okay, you're going to take a few weeks off before the AP exam, concentrate on prepping for those. before sort of resuming prep if you're going to take that again later on in the late spring, early summer. So this is all to say that there are a ton of different considerations for each student. And, if like you were a fencer or something like that, or some other sport, and I don't know when the season is for that, but just figuring out what works best for you when your heavy season is, avoiding those times. It all comes down to planning essentially. So that diagnostic test is super important up front. Having that analysis and the advising on when to take the test. So that's something that we offer complimentary for any student, regardless of whether or not you sign up, which is why I really like working with Karen, because we're able to sort of establish a plan for students in that way. And I think, being able to work closely, not only on the test prep front, but on the application front, because she can give you all the information about, let's think about what classes you're taking and, all the other components. And we help you concentrate on just this one aspect, which, is not the end all be all, but is quite nebulous, especially nowadays. So just more knowledge is power when it comes to where you are and where you want to be and the best way to get there. So yeah, that's it in terms of prep. So this is my contact information here if you have any questions.
Any final thoughts, Erica, or anything you want, families that are maybe watching this on demand later, any specific recommendations for them or thoughts for them before we wrap things up?
No, I mean, I think, at the end of the day, it's just about figuring out what works best for each individual student. I think having that advice from someone about what works for you really will make a huge load of difference, because there's a lot of muck to sort of sort through when it comes to all of this. And yeah, that's what we're here for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think my final thought about this whole thing is, obviously in the work that I do, working with individual families, I often get that question of like, where's a good rugby program, or where is this? And it's really, the goal is to really make sure that it's a good fit for each individual student, and knowing that each individual student is different. So it's really tough when you're like, I don't know, Johnny's like, oh, but everyone on my team is looking at this, or everyone on my team is doing the SAT. Why would I do the ACT? Well, it might mean that you're much better on the ACT than the SAT, and so really the college process in general really becomes very individualized, and what works for someone on your team or someone, your neighbor, may not work for you, and that's okay. And that the scores that your neighbor's trying to hit may not be the one you need to hit, and that's great. That's good to know. So I think just really focusing on this being an individual path, and that there's different ways to get to that path, is really important. So with that in mind, thank you so much for the families that joined us, making the time to hear about test prep. Erica, thank you so much. And we probably will do another update in like 6 to 8 months, and we'll see how things have gone. And it's great to see you, and we'll talk soon.
Fantastic. Thank
Okay.
you.
Bye.
Bye.